Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and it is my 8th year anniversary on this platform. Thank you all so much for sticking around this long, especially the past year and change. I've really appreciated it, trust me. But beyond that, we're heading into the album that y'all all voted on, came right down to the wire, from Adrianne Lenker, Songs. So looking back on my anniversary reviews, what I find amusing is, for the most part, they don't tend to attract that much attention outside of my core audience, which is why most of you tend to know what I like to cover, and outside of that 2017 anniversary review for Stoney, most of y'all don't try to troll me, which I kind of appreciate. And thus, for this year, it seemed like it was going to be a horse race in between KSI, Adrianne Lenker, and the Koreatown Oddity, and then the G-Friend K-pop fanbase found my post. I can only assume that's why within a period of a couple hours, I found a swell of fans, or at least I think they're fans, they might just be duplicate accounts, all requesting the same EP in numbers that dwarfed any other request. And there was a part of me that was inclined to just veto it, but hell, some of this is on me. I probably need to consider a more secure way to structure this survey so it doesn't get hijacked from outside. I was genuinely assuming I would only have to deal with the one rabid K-pop fan base this past week. That being said, I was not against covering the act or K-pop in principle, and before the fans showed up, this was an act that got me some votes, so there was some interest, only for me to discover that G-Friend, they disbanded just over a month ago, and I gotta be honest, it doesn't feel right to make a review for an EP of a K-pop band that's no longer even active, especially when I have to compare them to the other acts on my docket that didn't get mass voted and are probably more representative of what my fan base actually wants to hear me talk about, which really is the purpose of these anniversary reviews. Plus there's a bit of a posthumous album thing, it falls in similar territory. But as such, going down to the wire here, well, alright. Now the conversation gets messy, because this is one of those artists for whom I've heard about a great deal, and I watched all the critical acclaim come in for the band, but I've been at a distance for some time, because I'm not really a Big Thief fan. Like most people, I became aware of them courtesy of their two critically acclaimed projects in 2019, where they got signed to 4AD, and suddenly got a promotional budget, and suddenly all the major publications knew about them and loved them. And while I mostly respected their breathy, ramshackle brand of indie folk rock, for the most part, I just was not all that enraptured by the writing, or the performances, or the mixing, or the melodies, or really any of the songs. I mean, it was fine for what it was. The sort of soft-focus indie material that can feel dime a dozen if you spend any time on Bandcamp, but is such obvious critic bait for a very certain audience that it's ridiculous. But I also know I'm rarely in that audience, and in my experience with singer-songwriter material, if I'm not gripped by the vocals or the writing, odds are it's just not going to stick with me. I've been down this road before. And given that the act we're talking about today, she's the lead vocalist and songwriter of Big Thief, that's kind of why I stayed away from covering Adrianne Lenker's solo work last year. I figured it was for the best. Now, I went back and actually checked out her solo albums, and well, you can definitely hear a more youthful and exuberant prototype of what she would make in Big Thief. And if you're into that brand of very stripped-back, intimate acoustic folk and you like her voice, you'll probably dig it. But apparently, this was the one. This was the project that properly put her over the top, the sort of simple but undeniable indie folk that was transcendent in its direct potency. This was the one that would make me a true believer. How is it? Oh god. You ever get just that sinking feeling in your gut when you find a piece of art, you get the appeal, you understand how and why it works, but it doesn't really work for you, and you just know you're gonna wind up in the minority opinion because of it, you don't even want to be contrary? Yeah, I hate to be let down here, but with every listen I gave to Songs, the more I got why some critics and a lot of audiences adored it, but once again I found myself at a bit of a distance, where I can say it's pretty, it's reasonably well composed, the poetry has its moments, but this doesn't move me, and I don't want to fake it. Hell, I can't fake it that it does. And while I just know that this review will go on long, at the very core, it's kind of the same basic issue I've had with Adrianne Lenker since the very beginning, and some of it is just this simple when it kind of has to be when the arrangements are this stripped down. I don't really care for her vocals. And it's no one major thing I dislike here either. She's not a great technical singer, but for this brand of winsome indie folk, she doesn't have to be. The charm really comes in the vibe, the intimacy, the soft-focused cottagecore presentation, where even though she wrote this in the lockdown of last year, there's almost something timeless about her trilling, tentative delivery. But on some level, I'm also reminded of a lot of when I talked about A Crow Looked at Me by Mount Erie about 4 years ago, where I understood the emotional depth and the heartbreak he was experiencing, where it was intended to be so stripped back, so intimate that the reality became too much to bear. But if you can't emotionally connect to the intimacy of the presentation of the performance, you wind up kind of feeling awkward on the outside looking in. And that's kind of similar to the same feeling I have here. Now there's other factors. I don't get that magnetic pull of subtle charisma that some have really picked up on. The near baby voice cooing, it's not a vocal timbre that tends to work for me, even multi-tracked. There's a very pronounced twee side to her presentation that we'll talk about more about in the writing, but it's also not something I really get into, especially coming out of the early 2010s. The millennial folk scene got very commercialized and then drove it all into the ground. But I gotta say, I think it goes deeper than this, and it actually touches on something I've talked about before. Pure acoustic folk singer-songwriter stuff doesn't often have the flavor to really stick for me. I tend to gravitate to the material that's got more texture, it's got more of a country or rock vibe, or has a Celtic undercurrent in the compositions, or even might pull from a well of soul, or R&B, or blues. Hell, I like when R&B gets more acoustic. Adrianne Lenker, meanwhile, she's playing deformed, straight down the middle, with a sort of layered, cyclical compositions that clearly show somebody with a lot of talent, a meticulous eye for detail, studied almost to a fault. Where when I discovered that she went to Berkeley, my response was, oh, of course she did. I can really hear it. And once you do hear it, it kind of puts a hole in some of that atmosphere, where you realize just how much of that homespun intimacy feels a little constructed, because of course there's going to be birdsong, touches of rain and wind chimes. You can hear the fragments of the recording process, the touches of tape reel, and so much creaking acoustic texture. That's what you do when you're trying to make this sort of acoustic folk album, create that feel of intimacy in the same way you might hear the vinyl crackle for an album that's trying to sound retro. Maybe it wouldn't feel so obvious if the album varied itself a little more. This is a project that drops into that spare mid-tempo acoustic vibe and only barely shifts within it. But for a project that really needs that organic, intimate, serious atmosphere to work, if it feels compromised in any way, it kind of takes you out of the experience. And when I say that, it mostly just fades into the background. Less bad than just kind of inoffensive. So okay, I thought maybe she's going for more of a constructed approach, more of a parallel to Joanna Newsom. There's certainly some vocal similarities and a similar studied, meticulous feel to the compositions, but no, that's not it. Joanna Newsom's way more expressive and theatrical and fey, even when she gets twee. This is not aiming for that. This is going for a broader universality and working with the pure refinement of the composition. This is the same sort of stuff I praised Jason Eady for, and he's not a strong vocalist either. In fact, that's kind of a parallel that makes a lot of sense. I see the appeal, but if anything, it kind of makes my point. Jason Eady absolutely relies on the same sense of intimacy and purity of presentation within the genre, but there's a blunt rawness that comes with country and cuts not just through his writing on the self-titled or Daylight in Dark, but also the rougher edges of his presentation, where it feels lived in and organic in a way that for Adrianne Lenker feels a bit constructed. But she wants to present it all as organic, and to be honest, at least for me, it doesn't always feel like it is. The other point is that in a lot of these compositions, the hooks are treated with casual disinterest. They're there sometimes, and at their best moment, there's a warm, borderline hypnotic quality to a few of them that does remind me a little bit of Kurt Weill or Neil Young, the latter of whom Lenker has described as an influence, and I can definitely hear it, especially in her uniformly excellent guitar work. She can really play. For instance, I like the methodical, slightly quicker cadence across the minor chords on In Gaidar, the subtle touches of gentle atmosphere that lets anything really come to life, that also slip into the shuffling warmth of Dragon Eyes, the slightly more immediate but no less layered heavy focus, and the more structured but playfully rambling composition of Zombie Girl. There are really good moments here, but it also immediately puts me in the mind of the Bandcamp conversation that I mentioned earlier, where a stigma that I will throw a bit on really a lot of the material on the platform is that they can be a little short on immediacy or melodic hooks, which of course you don't need to have, especially for this brand of intimate acoustic folk, but it does help individual songs stand out. It's one of those things you would not complain about if the hooks were there too. And it's kind of an issue I had with Big Thief as well. And it's kind of reminiscent of a problem you can see occasionally with musicians that come from a more technical background, where the disinterest in writing a catchy tune that'll stick with you, it's kind of palpable. They don't have to do it. This is just as prevalent in prog metal as it is in indie folk, but it reflects a lack of populism that doesn't always help cultivate that sense of intimacy. It's one reason why it's kind of difficult to pick out any real standout cuts here, and why this album can slip into the background so quickly for me. Sure, it's pretty, it's well arranged, it's very well produced, the warmth is certainly there, but without much modulation, it just kind of washes over me. And I wonder how distinct it really is from the rest of the field, and if more Bandcamp acts could just use 4AD's marketing budget. Otherwise, they'd get just as much acclaim. But for any folk singer-songwriter, especially one that's leaning back on stripped-back intimacy, conversation ultimately has to come down to the writing. That's the make-or-break moment. And again, it's one of those cases where I think I get it, but I'm just not nearly as impressed as everyone else seems like they are. Admittedly, some of it, again, personal preference. If you're gonna strip it all down, especially with the breakup of her girlfriend heavily on her mind, I normally prefer the poetry to pick up some rawness or some intensity as well, but Adrianne Lenker tends to weave around those points that she wants to make, and the diffuse structure of any sort of arc or storytelling on the album as a whole can make it kinda tough to grasp on the first couple of listens. Now granted, some of this is my own aversion to a brand of poetry that tends to be more twee, promise we'd come back to this, focusing more on metaphors and symbolism rooted in idyllic nature scenes, with a few moments that are trying to seem a little more edgy, like the shotgun reference on Anything and the dreams of Zombie Girl, but they don't really follow through that deeply. It's done more in order to make the scenes feel more homespun, but more often than not for me, it kind of dampens that intensity. And that's kind of a shame, because if you drill a little bit deeper, there are some interesting and heavy scenes going on, mostly surrounding themes of space and separating, partially tied into her breakup, but also expanding to a much broader tableau. Gee, you can almost tell this was written during a period of pandemic lockdown and isolation or something. But that's also reflected in a considerable amount of reflection on death on the album, which Adrianne Lenker most often frames as a natural consequence in the cycle of life, leaning really heavily into the balanced synergy of life and death, that duality, or how even despite the vast, infinite gulf between them, either by time's passage or just in concept itself, there is some connection that persists. And I do like how much there are some moments where the abstract metaphors feel bigger, like on Forward's Beck and Rebound, or on the chorus of Not a Lot, Just Forever, or even the near-death experience of My Angel, and you can tell they're really just wide-angle extrapolations of a former relationship still very much on her mind, where she clearly recognizes where she was probing and pushing it, but she still needs that dualistic experience, that connection. Hell, even on Zombie Girl, she's initially frightened of that darker force, but then they wind up in bed together and she finds herself trying to discover more, even within that darkness. Now, I could be crass and say that this album feels codependent as all hell, which of course she realizes. She is self-aware here, but can also start feeling a little cloying the more she repeats upon this territory. But to be fair, there are some moments that pick up some pathos. There's something very human about how Lenker feels that she must test and prod every connection, even with the dogs that might snap against any intrusion. Heavy Focus is a really good exploration of that too, and I like the metaphor of the camera. But also she desperately clings to things, a balanced and distinctly feminine paradigm worked out effectively on Not a Lot, Just Forever. And I really appreciate on Half Return how when she tries to go back home, she can't recapture that childhood emotion and picture. She's trying to build a parallel of angst across the years, but it's not one that can really coalesce. And I like the abrupt ending on My Angel, where being caught in that tension between life and death can feel so sudden, especially coming after her most direct love song on the album with Dragon Eyes. Her writing can do some really interesting things with tension and a fascination with little infinities. You would think that her arrangements might actually reflect that scope beyond a lot of cyclical guitar patterns. Point would be capturing those smallest moments, they can still feel eternal. But then there's Come. I appreciate the piece that it's trying to convey to someone who is older, who is passing on, in this case directed at her producer's grandmother. But not only does it feel a little bit out of place for as dualistic as this album's themes can be, it doesn't really jive with that. When you realize it's in the context of the pandemic, it kind of feels placid in a way that it shouldn't. It's a naturalistic approach taken to a societal calamity that was anything but, especially last year. And then you realize the factors that allow Adrianne Lenker to take that tone, where the most pervasive angst was in her isolation. And suddenly all that organic intimacy breaks all over again, but this time from without. But here's the thing. As a balm in that time and place in late October 2020, I get the respite an album like this might provide. It allows an escape into something that's more winsome and reflective, as a lot of the more relaxed works released in the past 18 months have. And it has me wondering if I'm asking questions of how reflective the vibe is even now. That has me wondering how this album might age. Because that's the thing. Because as much as this album's stripped-back approach will want to play for timelessness and the universality of the intimacy, there's a lot of moments that make it feel so much more of its time, and that kind of mutes the impact for me, be it from the writing to, the vocal delivery, which despite being timeless in certain moments, is still very contemporary to a specific scene and era. And I think some of this goes beyond it's just not for me, because while that's true, I don't think this is a bad album by any means, but I think its appeal is more limited than it might seem. And while there is depth here, I'm not sure it's as consistently flattered in the ways that it could be, especially when it is considerably more by the numbers than many proclaim, and compositionally just does not stick out that much for me. I'm sorry. And as such, solid 6 out of 10. I hope given this lengthy explanation, you get where I come from with this. Don't just focus on the score. Nothing I can say can take away the calm and peace this album might have given you last year. But when it comes to songs, what can I say? There's others I like a little bit more. But thanks a lot for watching. If you would like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Once again, thank you all for 8 years on the platform. Even though the growth has slowed, and that's a little bit dispiriting, thanks YouTube. I'd really appreciate if you guys actually do stick around, try to promote, try to actually share my stuff across wherever you can. I do think that I do a pretty decent job, and my writing has improved considerably from back, 6-7 years ago. It was rough back then, it's better now. But hey, if you guys want to get involved and help support the channel, I really do appreciate it. So subscribe, have fun in the comments. I know this is going to attract some attention. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm still all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in helping support the channel, maybe get albums on my schedule, link to my Patreon right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated, tough times out there, but I would appreciate it. And if you guys want to get involved, there's your opportunity. Until next time, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.